In 1936, Ketchum, Idaho, was home to 100 year-round residents and a single general store. One store for the sheep ranchers. One store for the miners who had stayed on after the silver ran out. One store for a town the railroad's own maps barely bothered to mark. 90 years later, the same narrow valley fills every July with private aircraft. The densest concentration of personal wealth to gather anywhere on the continent, arriving for a conference nicknamed, only half as a joke, Summer Camp for Billionaires. Warren Buffett comes. So does Bill Gates. So do Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. None of them are there for the skiing, exactly, and none of them built what brought them there. That belonged to a railroad heir who never set out to build a resort at all, only to sell train tickets to a country that had stopped buying them. A solution that would outlive the trains, the railroad, and the man who built it. Chapter 1. A Valley Waiting for Something to Want It. The Wood River Valley sits high in central Idaho, a basin of sagebrush and river gravel walled in by 3 mountain ranges that give it its climate before they give it its name. The boulders rise to the north, the Smoky Mountains close the western flank, and the Pioneers hold the eastern line, their peaks still carrying snow into July. Together they wring the moisture out of every storm that tries to cross them, and what reaches the valley floor arrives dry. More than 300 days a year, the sun clears those ridgelines and finds nothing to block it. No coastal haze, no lake effect cloud bank, no marine layer rolling in to soften the light. It is a valley built by geology to be sunlit, decades before anyone thought to sell it as one. In 1936, nobody was selling it as anything. Ketchum had been a mining camp once, and camps like it did not age gracefully. Prospectors staked claims in the hills above town in the early 1880s, chasing silver-lead ore through granite that gave it up grudgingly. For a few years, the ground produced. Smelters ran, boarding houses filled, and the camp took its name from a trapper who had wintered there before the ore was even found. Then, the veins thinned. The silver market buckled under a national panic, and the miners who could leave, left. What remained by 1936 was a town of shepherds and stubborn holdouts, men who ran sheep through the high pastures in summer and waited out the winters in houses built for a boom that had already ended 40 years earlier. The mines were not worked. The smelters were cold. Only the sheep still moved through that country in any real number, trailing down from the pioneers each fall in bands that could take an hour to cross a single road. Beneath the sagebrush and the played-out claims, though, sat an asset nobody in Ketchum thought to call one, a railroad. The Union Pacific had built a spur line into the valley back in 1883, at the height of the Silver Rush, laying track up from the main transcontinental route to haul out what the mountains produced. Ore went south on that line. Wool went south on that line. Bales of it stacked on flat cars bound for mills that never saw the valley itself. Passengers rode it too, but as a means, not a destination. Miners coming in, wool buyers passing through, nobody arriving because the place itself was worth arriving for. By 1936, the line still ran, still met its schedule, still turned its wheels twice a day into a town of shepherds and abandoned headframes. It was track that led somewhere and meant nothing. No reason for the run, no market waiting at either end, no future, as far as anyone standing in Ketchum could tell, distinct from its past. That was the arithmetic of the place in the middle of the 1930s. A spur line built for ore that had stopped moving, a town site built for miners who had stopped coming, and 3 mountain ranges holding back the clouds for no audience larger than a few hundred sheep and the men who followed them. The valley had sunlight it did not need, and a railroad it could not use, and neither counted for anything without someone willing to look at empty track and ask what else it might carry. Ketchum's own residents were not asking. They had watched booms end before, and this looked to anyone who had lived through 1893 like a town settling quietly into whatever came after usefulness. 900 miles east, in an office far from any sagebrush, a different kind of arithmetic was already being worked out. One involving not ore or wool, but ticket sales, and a railroad company's ledgers bleeding a currency the valley itself had never touched. That reckoning had nothing to do with Ketchum yet. It would. Chapter 2. The Man Who Inherited the Rails. The office belonged to William Averill Harriman, and the railroad belonged to him too, in the way that inheritances belong to men who did not build them. He was born in New York City on November 15, 1891, the son of Edward Henry Harriman, a self-made financier who had assembled the Union Pacific and Southern Pacific into a single continental machine through hostile takeovers, ruthless refinancing, and a temperament nobody in the business world cared to cross twice. Averill learned the family trade at Groton, then at Yale, then at a boardroom table he had not yet earned the right to sit at. In 1910, at 19, while he was still an undergraduate, he was elected to the board of directors of the Union Pacific, a seat purchased by his father's name before Averill had closed a single deal of his own. He would not run the company outright for another 22 years. He would inherit it instead. In 1932, with his father 11 years dead and the country 3 years into its worst economic collapse in a century, Averill Harriman became chairman of the Union Pacific Railroad. He inherited a company, not a fortune waiting to be spent. Timetables built for a nation that no longer rode trains the way it once had came with it, and so did a passenger division bleeding revenue with each passing season. As buses grew cheaper, automobiles grew more common on newly paved highways, and Americans who had once bought a ticket out of necessity now increasingly found reasons not to. Union Pacific's rails ran through some of the most desolate country in the American West. Southern Idaho, high desert, sagebrush flats. Territory nobody had ever needed convincing to visit because nobody had ever gone there to sightsee. Convincing them was now his job. Harriman's answer arrived from Europe. The fashionable resorts of the Alps, St. Moritz, Kitzbühel, Garmisch, had spent a decade filling hotels with wealthy travelers willing to cross an ocean for cold air and a mountainside, and if Europe's aristocracy would pay for snow, Harriman reasoned, so would America's, provided the snow came wrapped in a comparable degree of comfort and the right kind of publicity. The plan, at its inception, had nothing to do with real estate. It had nothing to do with mountains for their own sake, or with the folklore of the American West that would later attach itself to the venture. It was, at bottom, a scheme to sell railroad tickets, first-class round-trip sleeper car tickets, to a destination that did not yet exist, built by a company that happened to own the only tracks that could get a passenger there. The resort was the bait. The railroad was the business. What Harriman did not have was a mountain. Union Pacific's western routes crossed a great deal of unremarkable terrain, flat, brown, undistinguished by anything a European traveler would recognize as alpine, and no one at the company had ever been asked to evaluate a landscape for its skiing rather than its mineral rights or its grazing potential. Harriman needed a scout, and not merely a competent one, someone who had actually stood on the slopes of the Alps and could recognize their equivalent in unfamiliar country, someone whose judgment about snow and gradient and vista could be trusted absolutely, because the entire premise of the venture depended on getting the location right on the first attempt, with no second chance and no advertising budget for a mountain that turned out to be mediocre. He found that man in a family friend, an Austrian count named Felix Schafgotsch, who agreed to cross the Atlantic and search the American West for a mountain that did not yet know it was famous. Schafgotsch set out with a valise, a letter of introduction, and no fixed itinerary. Harriman had given him a continent to search and no deadline he was willing to name out loud. Chapter 3: The Wire from Ketchum. Schafgotsch traveled with a rancher's patience and a count's exacting eye, and for weeks he found nothing to justify the crossing. Washington State offered slopes too gentle and snow too wet to hold a season worth building on. He passed. California offered land already claimed, already priced, already crowded with speculators chasing the same idea he was chasing. He passed on that too. Utah offered altitude without shelter, peaks that punished rather than welcomed, valleys that offered nothing to a man building a resort rather than surviving a winter. And he moved on from that as well. Letters went back to New York, describing towns that almost worked and did not. 3 states, dozens of towns, and not a single telegram sent east. Harriman waited. On January 16, 1936, the Count's train stopped in Ketchum, Idaho, a mining town down to its last few families, and a handful of streets that froze solid by November and stayed that way until spring. He stepped into the valley the locals called Warm Springs and did not leave it. The snow held dry and light, sheltered from the coastal fronts that had ruined every sight before it, warmed by a sun that broke through more mornings than the surveyors had dared hope for after a search that had already run 4 months longer than planned. He wired Harriman before the sun went down. "This is the place," the message read. Nothing in it was longer than that. Union Pacific moved the way railroads moved when they wanted a low price and no competing bidders, quietly. Company men bought the old Brass Ranch, a spread of pasture and sagebrush at the valley floor, through intermediaries who never once mentioned Harriman's name at the closing table, never once let a local newspaper catch the scent of what was forming. Ketchum's ranchers sold cheap, unaware that a chairman in New York had already decided their grazing land would become the most photographed acreage in American skiing. The paperwork closed within weeks, filed in county offices by men who signed nothing under their own company's letterhead. By the time anyone in Ketchum thought to ask what the company wanted with the land, survey stakes were already going in. Construction began before the last snow of that same season had melted off the valley floor. Crews raised a 4-story lodge of concrete and timber in roughly 7 months, working through a summer that gave them long light and through an autumn that did not, racing a winter deadline that Harriman had set and would not move. The final bill came to $1.5 million, an extraordinary sum for a building meant to house skiers in a town most of the country could not yet have located on a map. Local contractors called the pace reckless. Union Pacific called it a schedule. Freight cars brought in what the valley itself could not supply. The lodge outran the roads meant to reach it. The name came last, and it came from a desk in Omaha rather than a mountain in Idaho. Union Pacific's own publicity department, still weeks from a finished building, needed something to put on a brochure, and they reached for the one fact that had sold Shaftgotch on the valley in the first place: the sun. More than 300 days of it a year, the surveyors had logged, more than almost anywhere else the railroad served. So the mining camp above the old Brass Ranch became Sun Valley before a single guest had checked in, before the paint had dried, before the plumbing had been tested, before anyone had skied a run that carried the name. It was a resort born already famous, at least on paper. That paper, though, was still just a company's own paper. Internal memos, a railroad's private ambition. What Sun Valley needed next was not more concrete or more steam pipe. It needed someone to make the entire country believe the sun shone nowhere else, and to make that belief arrive well before the first paying guest ever did. Union Pacific already had a name in mind for that job, a publicist out of New York named Steve Hannigan, and he had not yet written a word of it. The campaign that would make Sun Valley a household name was still sitting unstarted on his desk. Chapter 4: The Lift That Never Existed Before. Steve Hannigan was a Bloomington newspaperman turned press agent who had already made Miami Beach into a national fantasy out of a sandbar nobody in New York had wanted before him. Hannigan arrived at Sun Valley in the autumn of 1936 with a budget and no restrictions. And what he did with both was simple to describe and audacious to execute. He sent photographers into the Idaho snow and pointed them at young women in swimsuits, skis strapped on, sunglasses pushed into their hair, sunbathing on a mountainside at 8,000 feet. The captions promised sunshine, altitude, and glamour in a single frame. Winter, in Hannigan's telling, was not a season to be endured at Sun Valley. It was a costume to be worn. No chairlift had carried a passenger yet. No lodge had opened its doors yet. No guest had paid $1 to sleep there yet. Hannigan's photographs went out regardless, syndicated across newspapers from New York to Los Angeles, while construction crews were still pouring concrete for the lodge's foundation, and readers in cities that had never heard of the Sawtooth Mountains came to believe Sun Valley already existed as a glittering resort where beautiful people skied under a permanent sun. The resort was sold before it was built. That was the entire method, and Hannigan would spend the better part of 2 decades refining it across every property Union Pacific asked him to promote. The glamour needed a machine to support it, because rope tows dragged skiers up the mountain at walking pace, dropped exhausted riders in the snow at the top, and could not move enough people per hour to fill a resort Hannigan was already advertising as full. Union Pacific's engineers were told to solve the problem. James Curran was a Union Pacific engineer who had spent his career designing conveyance systems for the railroad's freight operations, not for mountain recreation, and Curran took up the assignment in 1935 with no precedent anywhere on Earth to draw from. He found his answer not on a ski slope, but on the docks, in the mechanism United Fruit Company used to load stems of bananas onto its cargo boats, a moving belt fitted with hooks that carried the load up and over without ever stopping. Curran replaced the hook with a suspended chair, mounted it on a looping steel cable, and gave the mountain a machine built to move fruit that would end up moving people instead. On December 21, 1936, the lift opened on Proctor Mountain. It was the first chairlift built anywhere on Earth, a string of open chairs swinging up a cable at a pace no rope tow could approach, carrying skiers who did nothing but sit while the mountain did the climbing beneath them. Within a decade, the design would be standing on every serious ski mountain on the planet, copied and refined, but never fundamentally reinvented. Curran had solved a shipping problem in an afternoon and handed the ski industry its defining piece of equipment in the process. Picture the lodge that same week, opening night, December 21, 1936, timber walls still smelling of fresh-cut wood, snow falling through the floodlights outside as guests arrived by private rail car in furs and dinner jackets. Austrian instructors, hired whole out of the Alps to teach a sport most of the arriving guests had never attempted, stood at the edge of the country's first dedicated ski school in matching parkas. Someone lit the outdoor fireplace. Someone asked, over the first round of cocktails, whether the chairlift outside was really as safe as the brochure claimed. The chairlift held every time someone asked. They found out within 2 winters what else the resort could hold. The trains arriving from Los Angeles were no longer carrying only skiers eager for the novelty of Curran's machine. They were carrying names the newspapers already recognized, faces the cameras had been waiting years to catch off the studio lot. A different kind of glamour than the one Hannigan had staged for the wire services, and one that for the first time did not need a press agent to invent it. Chapter 5. The Last Peacetime Winters. The names arrived the way avalanches do, a few at first, then a slope full. Within the resort's first 2 winters, Clark Gable was skiing Dollar Mountain in borrowed sunglasses and an assumed name that fooled no one. Marlene Dietrich was doing the same in furs better suited to a Berlin premiere than a chairlift, indifferent to who was watching. Ginger Rogers came, stayed longer than she had meant to, and came back the following year. Gary Cooper came too, a rancher's son who skied the way he rode, without apparent effort and without apparent interest in being seen doing it. None of the 4 had been sent by a studio publicity department, and none needed to be. Hannigan's wire service invitations had built the road, but the road, once built, no longer required his hand on the wheel. By the second season, the lodge register read less like a hotel ledger than a studio call sheet mailed 600 miles from Culver City. Ernest Hemingway was a Midwestern-born novelist and war correspondent who had already spent 2 decades building, on 3 continents, a reputation for seeking gunfire more readily than cameras. He arrived at Sun Valley in the autumn of 1939 and took a suite at the lodge, where he spread the manuscript of For Whom the Bell Tolls across a desk and worked through the following weeks with a discipline his skiing never matched. He told friends more than once that what he valued about the place had nothing to do with the mountain and everything to do with the fact that no one there treated him like anyone in particular. It was an odd form of privacy to seek in a lodge full of movie stars, but Hemingway had spent most of his adult life being looked at and had grown particular about who was permitted to do it. It was that same autumn that his friendship with Gary Cooper hardened into something durable. The two men had little in common beyond a taste for the outdoors and an aversion to being watched while indulging it, and on that narrow foundation, they built 2 decades of return trips into the sagebrush flats east of the resort, shotguns broken over their arms, working pheasant and duck out of the brush together season after season. Neither man required an introduction to the other's fame, and neither offered one. The friendship needed no press agent to sustain it, which was, by then, becoming something of a house tradition, and one Hannigan himself had learned not to interfere with. Commercial validation, when it came in 1941, arrived from a source the railroad had not engineered and could not have purchased at any price. Darryl Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, took his own vacation at the resort and returned to Los Angeles convinced it deserved a picture built entirely around it, not merely used as a backdrop. The result was Sun Valley Serenade, a musical starring the figure skater Sonia Heaney, and scored by Glenn Miller's orchestra, which earned $2.25 million in rentals on its release that year. A modest sum against the studio's prestige pictures, but a vast and unpaid advertisement for a town that, 5 years earlier, had appeared on no map most Americans owned. People who would never touch a pair of skis learned the name Sun Valley from a movie screen before they learned it from a railroad brochure. By that autumn, the lodge was already booking rooms for the winter to come. Newsgruber, mailing confirmations to the same California addresses and the same New York addresses it always had, penciling familiar names beside familiar dates, as though the previous 4 winters were a pattern that would simply continue, unbroken, into a 5th. Gable was expected again. So was Cooper. So, the reservations clerk had every reason to assume was Hemingway. Once the manuscript was finished and the itch for open country returned, the desk kept a calendar that turned toward December the way it had every year since 1936, ordinary and unremarkable, the way calendars turn in places that have not yet been told what they are about to become. Nothing about the 7th of that month gave any clerk in Sun Valley reason to look at it twice. Chapter 6. The Lodge Becomes a Ward. The Navy did not want the mountains. It wanted the beds. Pearl Harbor had been struck on the 7th of December, 1941, and the year that followed carried the country through a mobilization no resort brochure could keep pace with. Shipyards running double shifts, draft boards filling ledgers by the column, the Pacific consuming men faster than replacements could be trained and shipped. Sun Valley's calendar, which had turned toward December so many times before without incident, turned once more, and this time the reckoning arrived on schedule. On December 20th, 1942, the resort canceled reservations by the hundreds, a number its ledgers had never approached in either direction, and handed the entire property to the United States Navy. There was no ceremony recorded for the handover, no farewell tour of the runs Schaff Gotch had once ridden a mule to find. The lodge that Harriman had built to sell railroad tickets became, in a single stroke of paperwork, a military asset. By the middle of 1943, the ballroom where guests had once turned circles under electric light had become a ward, its dance floor lined with cots instead of orchestra chairs. The guest halls that had hosted Gable, Dietrich, and Rogers were converted room by room into recovery wings, the furniture removed to storage. The fireplaces kept burning for men who arrived shivering regardless of the season. Over the following 2.5 years, nearly 7,000 wounded and battle-fatigued sailors passed through Sun Valley on their way back from the Pacific Theater. A number the peacetime resort would not have filled in a decade of winters. The dry mountain air that had once been marketed for drying ski wax was now prescribed for drying out malarial lungs. The hot sulfur pools that had once eased skiers' sore legs were now used to ease legs that had been shattered by shrapnel and shipboard falls. The same slopes that Steve Hannigan had once sold as a tonic for boredom were now, without irony or adjustment to the copy, a tonic for men whose nerves had not survived Guadalcanal or Tarawa. Nothing about the treatment changed. Only the patients did. The resort reopened to the public in December 1945, 3 years to the month after it had closed to them, its wards stripped back down to guest rooms and its ballroom swept clean of cots. The war had cost Sun Valley its glamour years almost entirely. Gable did not return. Dietrich did not return. The studio contracts that had once timed their vacations around the snow had scattered to other purposes. What returned instead was smaller and stranger, fewer stars, more veterans, a resort that had spent its formative middle years as a hospital and now had to relearn, room by room, how to be a stage. One figure did return and kept returning long after the cameras had gone elsewhere. Ernest Hemingway came back to Sun Valley across the years that followed the war, drawn by the same hunting and the same quiet that had brought him there before it, and in 1959 he bought a house on the Big Wood River, a few miles down from the lodge in the small town of Ketchum. He made it his home. He died there in 1961. None of this restored what the war had interrupted. Harriman had built Sun Valley to sell train tickets, not lift tickets, and the arrangement had worked exactly as designed for a decade. Glamour photographed in the snow, glamour converted into fares, fares converted into revenue for the Union Pacific. But the country that came home from the war was buying automobiles by the million and airline seats by the thousand. And the passenger trains that had carried Gable and Cooper and every star before them toward Ketchum were about to become the least profitable thing the railroad owned. The resort had survived the Navy. The railroad that built it was next. Chapter 7. The Railroad Loses Interest. It began, as these things tend to, with a balance sheet. For 3 decades, the entire architecture of Sun Valley had rested on a single, unspoken transaction. Union Pacific would build glamour, and glamour would sell train tickets. Harriman had understood this from the start, and Hannigan had sold it to the country without ever stating it outright. But a premise built on how Americans traveled could not survive a change in how Americans traveled. And in the 2 decades after the war, that change arrived with the finality of a verdict. The automobile took the weekend traveler first. Then the interstate took the family vacationer, laying 4 lanes of asphalt through country a passenger train once had to itself. What was left, the jet took, folding a 2-day rail journey into a 2-hour flight and making the romance of the sleeper car look, almost overnight, like a relic from another century. Union Pacific had not lost Sun Valley's guests. It had lost the reason anyone needed to ride a train to reach them. By the early 1960s, the numbers inside Union Pacific's ledgers had stopped being an embarrassment and become a liability. The resort, that had once justified itself as advertising, an expense written off against the ticket revenue it was presumed to generate, now generated losses with no ticket revenue behind them to offset. Passenger rail nationwide was contracting year over year, and a railroad answerable to shareholders could no longer defend a mountain resort in central Idaho on the grounds that it made people want to ride trains that fewer and fewer people were riding at all. Executives who had never set foot on Proctor Mountain were now the ones deciding its fate. And they decided it the way distant executives generally do, by the column that showed red. The math that had once flattered Harriman's vision now indicted it. A company does not sentimentalize a subsidiary it can no longer explain. In 1964, Union Pacific sold Sun Valley outright. The buyer was Jantz Corporation, a Los Angeles real estate and development firm run by Bill Jantz, a member of the 1936 United States Olympic ski team who had spent the years since building and selling mountain property across the West. The railroad that had invented the destination ski resort as a mechanism for filling train cars no longer wanted to be in the resort business at all. And it said so with the plainest instrument a corporation has, a signature on a bill of sale. Jantz brought no railroad behind him, only capital and a skier's understanding of what the mountain needed. Under his ownership, between 1965 and 1977, Sun Valley grew in a direction Harriman had never planned for. 575 condominium units rose across the valley floor, and the resort stopped being a seasonal destination reached by an overnight sleeper and became, gradually, a place where people simply lived. Jantz built a year-round community out of what had been a winter advertisement, but Jantz Corporation was not Union Pacific. It did not have a continent-spanning railroad's balance sheet behind it, and by the mid-1970s, the capital to expand the resort further had run out before the ambition had. The railroad's exit completed itself in 1971, with a scale that made Union Pacific's 1964 sale look like the opening move rather than the conclusion. That year, Amtrak absorbed nearly all intercity passenger rail service remaining in the United States, and Union Pacific handed over what little of its own passenger operation it still ran. The company that had built an entire resort town to keep Americans riding its trains no longer operated passenger trains of any kind, anywhere, for anyone. The railroad had outlived its own reason for building Sun Valley by 7 years. It would not outlive Sun Valley itself. Jantz carried the resort through the rest of the decade on that same premise, that a mountain does not sustain itself on the memory of what it once meant to a railroad, but the capital thinned faster than the ambition did, and the valley that Union Pacific had once sold to the country as a monument to its own reach sat by the mid-1970s, waiting quietly for an owner who could finish what a ski racer's real estate firm had started. That owner was still 3 years and one oil company away. He would not come from the railroad business at all. Chapter 8. The Inventory of What Remains. He arrived in 1977, and he arrived from Utah, not from the boardrooms in Washington or New York that had shaped the valley before him. Earl Holding was an oil man, a self-made refiner who had built Sinclair Oil into a private empire on gasoline, motels, and a temperament that trusted no partner he had not chosen himself. That year, Sinclair Oil paid roughly $12 million for Sun Valley, closing out the resort's third change of ownership in barely 4 decades. First Union Pacific's monument to its own reach, then a ski racer's undercapitalized gamble, now an oil company's private acquisition. The price was modest against the size of the company buying it. The commitment was not. Holding rebuilt tired lifts, expanded terrain, and ran the resort as a possession to be kept whole, not an investment to be flipped. His family owns it still, the only one of the valley's 3 owners whose era never ended in retreat. The valley he bought has changed shape since, though not in outline. Sun Valley's year-round population today numbers under 1,800 people, fewer residents than a single mid-sized apartment building might hold in a larger city. The median home now sells for roughly $1.5 million, and the largest of the private estates exceed $4 million without much resistance from the market. Scarcity did that as much as skiing did. A resort built to sell empty land now sells the fact that none is left, and scarcity is patient, and it waited. Each July now, the Allen and Company Conference fills the lodge with a different clientele than the Valley has hosted before. Warren Buffett arrives. Bill Gates arrives. Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg arrive behind them, and the four of them sit in the same rooms where wounded sailors were once sent to mend under mountain light and borrowed sun. The war that built the lodge's first purpose is long over. The money filling it now was not born in mountains at all, but the arrangement, sun, altitude, isolation, exclusivity, is exactly the one Harriman designed in 1936, sold under a different pitch. The original Sun Valley Lodge still stands at the center of all of it, 4 stories of stucco and timber unchanged in outline since Harriman's engineers finished it in the autumn of 1936. It is not a museum piece. It operates, checks in guests, serves dinner, exactly as function required on the first day. That continuity is rarer than the wealth gathered around it now. The railroad that made the pitch is the detail worth returning to. Harriman built Sun Valley to sell train tickets, a few thousand more passengers a year riding Union Pacific rails toward a resort that existed, at first, mostly to justify the fare. The passenger trains that carried them stopped running decades ago, retired by highways and airplanes, and a country that stopped organizing vacations around a timetable. The scheme built to move a few more people west outlived the very trains it was built to fill, by more than 50 years and counting. Ketchum, in 1936, had one general store and a single spur of track running past it. The valley above it now has neither the store, nor the spur, nor any of the trains that carried the guests who built its name. What survives is what no boxcar ever carried, the mountain that never moved, the lift line that took the railroad's old promise of arrival and made it literal, and the sun, the whole enterprise, was named for in the first place. At the top of Bald Mountain, the Summit Lift Terminal still stands where the engineers anchored it in the resort's first years, a plain steel frame bolted into bare rock. In late afternoon, the steel turns the color of rust and honey at once, and the cable above it hums faintly in wind that never fully stops. Below, the valley floor slides into shadow while the summit still holds the light, gold, for another 20 minutes before the color drains out of it. It was built, like everything else here, to move people toward a view a railroad had decided the country should pay to see. A machine for arrival, standing now with no one arriving, doing the one thing it was never built to do alone: hold still and wait. It does not need the trains anymore. It only needs the sun, and the sun still comes.